Yeah, I thought it was an excellent description of realism. I actually liked how you talked about the minor powers navigating through the waters, where the superpowers or the great powers dominate. It was very well put.
Thank you. I'll let you use that free of charge. You're welcome to use that, but thank you very much. So let's start. Let's just begin with the recent decision of the International Court of Justice in the case of South Africa versus Israel. On January 26, the ICJ found that Israel had a plausible case to answer for genocide in Gaza and ordered it to immediately halt all potentially genocidal acts. The day after the ruling, you wrote, quote, "It seems clear that yesterday was a black day for Israel, as the ICJ order will leave a deep and lasting stain on its reputation." Can you expand on that? Why do you think this will leave a deep and lasting stain?
Well, the fact is that the ICJ, looking at the evidence, said there was sufficient evidence available to think that Israel was waging a genocidal campaign against Palestinians in Gaza. I find this to be a remarkable conclusion when you take into account the fact that this is the Jewish state, and Jews, of course, were victims of one of the greatest genocides in recorded history, and that, of course, has to do with what the Nazis did between 1941 and 1945. And to think that the Jewish state stands accused of genocide is really quite remarkable. And in this day and age, when you have an internet and you have all this alternative media, it's almost impossible for the word regarding genocide and Israel's behavior, or the words involving genocide and Israel's behavior, not to sort of spread all over the world. And all sorts of people now understand what the ICJ said in late January. And there's no way this cannot do enormous damage to Israel's reputation. And by the way, to America's reputation as well, because the United States is complicitous in this genocide.
Absolutely. I mean, it's co-authoring this genocide. What do you think Israel is trying to achieve in Gaza? They always say that their goal is to destroy Hamas, to eliminate Hamas, to make sure Hamas doesn't have any power or legitimacy, or to turn the people against Hamas. Is that really the goal, or is it ethnic cleansing and genocide?
Well, I think the principal goal was ethnic cleansing. I think that Israel's in a situation now where, given the fact that it rejects a two-state solution and it rejects a democratic greater Israel, it's faced with two choices. One is apartheid, which of course is what you now have, or two is ethnic cleansing. And what the Israelis set out to do, in my opinion, from the get-go in Gaza, was ethnically cleanse Gaza. Now, you want to think about the whole argument that many defenders of Israel make, which is that they weren't interested in ethnic cleansing, and what they were really interested in doing was eliminating Hamas. There's no way you can eliminate Hamas unless you either kill all the Palestinians in Gaza or you ethnically cleanse Gaza. As long as the Palestinians remain in Gaza, you're going to have Hamas, or you're going to have a Hamas equivalent. Israel is never going to win a total victory against Hamas and do away with terrorist activities. It's just not going to happen. The Palestinians are going to resist. So again, you have two choices: ethnically cleanse or kill all the Palestinians. And what the Israelis were doing was waging a punishment campaign against the civilian population. The Israelis put their crosshairs on the civilian population. They didn't just simply go after Hamas. They went after the civilian population. And in my opinion, they wanted to drive them out of the Gaza Strip. They wanted another Nakba. It was very clear to me. And of course, they have been completely unsuccessful up to this point in terms of achieving that goal, thankfully, I would add. But in the end, they have killed lots of Palestinians. They have killed so many Palestinians, and they have done so many horrible things to the Palestinian people, that it is easy to reach the conclusion, as the ICJ did, that there is substantial evidence or plausible evidence that Israel is in the process of committing genocide. I mean, that's how horrible things are.
So if as you say, if, as we all clearly agree, the US is the co-author of this, if, as you say, Israel is killing thousands of people and the description of genocide is very plausible, why is the United States government and the Biden administration assisting and allowing Israel to commit genocide? Is it also the goal of the United States to ethnically cleanse Gaza? They say it's not, but they're helping Israel, at least in its attempt to do it. And do U.S. leaders not clearly see how damaging Israel's crimes are, not just to Palestinians, of course, but also to the influence and stature of the United States? Why is the United States going along with this brutal, horrifying insanity?
Well, I think that the original reason that Biden committed the United States wholeheartedly to supporting Israel, no matter what it did in Gaza, was because he has a passionate attachment to Israel. A lot of presidents, a lot of policymakers, a lot of politicians say that they're deeply committed to Israel and to Israel's security, but they just say that for political purposes. I think in the case of Biden, it is true. He is, in effect, joined at the hip with Israel. And he identified with Israel after October 7th, and he committed the United States to supporting Israel from the get-go. So that's point one. Second point, in many ways the more important point, is that the Israel lobby is a remarkably powerful institution here in the United States. It is remarkably powerful. And it is almost impossible for anybody in the White House to challenge Israeli policy, no matter what it is, when it comes to the Palestinians. If we're talking about an arms deal with Saudi Arabia, it is possible for a president to challenge the lobby, as Ronald Reagan did in the 1980s. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's almost impossible. So what's happened here, and it's quite clear, is that as this military operation by the IDF has played itself out, the Biden administration has become incredibly uncomfortable with what's going on. It's clear that Biden wants to shut this one down, even though he has a passionate attachment, which raises the question, why can't he shut it down? And the answer is the lobby. I
mean, obviously, I agree that the lobby is very powerful. We see the lobby at work in many places, particularly in universities, in terms of bullying and pressuring and harassing academics and the way they respond to any critical media report and the way politicians are punished. certainly the Israel lobby is extremely present and powerful. But I want to push back a little bit on this because it's a criticism we see. I mean, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. There is this account that's been circulating in the past couple of months, well sourced. It comes from I don't remember now the book, but it was from someone who was present in the Reagan era. In 1982. President Reagan was so horrified by Israel's bombardment of West Beirut, this was during the Israeli invasion in 1982, that he picked up the phone and spoke to Menachem Begin, who was the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, and said, "This needs to stop, and I mean it." And he said it was a Holocaust, what Israel was doing in West Beirut at that time. And reportedly, Menachem Begin gave him all sorts of, said, Mr. President, I know what a Holocaust looks like. I don't need a lecture on that. But President Reagan was firm, and he hung up the phone, and Menachem Begin called back after 20 minutes and said, "I've ordered Ariel Sharon, who was the defense minister, to stop the bombing." So that's one phone call Biden could make. The other phone call he could make is to the Pentagon, and maybe Lloyd Austin would pick up or not. I don't know where Lloyd Austin is these days, and maybe the president doesn't know either. But he could say to Lloyd Austin, stop or delay the 24-hour airlift of weapons and bombs that are being used. And I get that the lobby is politically powerful, but here we just saw last night in Michigan, in the Michigan primary, a significant number of people refusing to vote for Biden in the Democratic primary as a protest of his support for this genocide. So you could argue that one, the president has the power to put a stop to this, and two, the political liability is now shifting to the other side, where supporting Israel is going to cost him his job. So in that context, can't we just can we put it all down to the lobby? Is what I'm saying.
Well, you can't put it all down to the lobby. My argument is that about 95% of it is due to the lobby. As I said before, you don't want to underestimate the extent to which Biden has a passionate attachment to Israel. But you raised a lot of different points, and they're all big points that need a lot of unpacking. First of all, with regard to what happened in Michigan, there's no question that Israel's image has suffered in the body politic. And when you look at especially young people, especially young Democrats, you have a situation where any president should be able to put significant pressure on Israel, given that situation with younger people and what happened in Michigan. But the problem is there's a difference between the public and the elites. And where the lobby concentrates its efforts is on the elites, on politicians. It has tremendous power on Capitol Hill, and it has tremendous power vis-a-vis the White House. And the White House understands, President Biden understands, that if he crosses Israel, which means crossing the lobby, that they will go to great lengths to make sure that he gets defeated in November. And of course, given that he's up for re-election, that's the last thing in the world that he wants. So Biden is caught between a rock and a hard place. Of course, he's worried sick about the fact that all these people in Michigan are effectively voting against him. But he's also worried sick that if he gets tough on the Israelis, he'll lose the election in the fall because they'll be perfectly willing to help elect Donald Trump, who won't get tough on Israel. So Biden is not doing anything. Now, just to go to the phone calls for a second, there's no question that Biden has also called Netanyahu, and he's hollered at Netanyahu. There's this story of the phone call, a long phone call in December, where Biden actually got so angry with him that he just hung up the phone on him. But it's not a matter of calling on the telephone, right? It's a matter of changing policy. As you surely know, Ali, we have the coercive leverage to bring Israel to its knees. I mean, we could easily cause the Israelis to stop this genocide. There's no question about it. It's a question of policy. But Biden simply feels that he can't do that. My final point to you is it's important to understand that the lobby's power has grown since 1982. Israel's first real problem with public opinion in the United States and with the elite, with opinion in the elite, was the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. And then, of course, after that, you had the first intifada in the late 1980s, then the breakdown of the Oslo process, then the second intifada, and so forth and so on. And over the course of time, Israel's reputation in the United States has suffered greatly. As a result, the lobby has had to redouble its efforts to defend Israel. So the lobby that you're dealing with today is a more formidable lobby than the lobby that Ronald Reagan was dealing with, and certainly than Dwight Eisenhower was dealing with. And it is very difficult, extremely difficult for any president to take on the lobby.
Well, that brings me, you answered one of the questions I had, but I guess since we're on the topic of Michigan and voting, does it actually make a difference who the president is when it comes to major foreign policy questions, and particularly Palestine? We see a lot of argument about this going backwards and forwards and saying, well, Biden is terrible, but Trump would be an even bigger disaster. I can tell you from the perspective of Palestinians, there's nothing worse than genocide. Genocide is as bad as it gets, and it's the worst case scenario now. Does it matter who people vote for when it comes to these questions?
From a Palestinian perspective, no. It's Tweedledee and Tweedledum. The president will provide unconditional support for Israel, whether he or she is a Democrat or a Republican. So I just don't think it matters.
Professor Mearsheimer, the U.S. seems to lurch from losing war to losing another war, leaving a wake of death and destruction in its path from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya to Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, and now Gaza. Why? What is it about the U.S.'s drive to invade, destroy other countries, and leave nothing but destruction and death in its wake? And how should we be looking at what's happening in Gaza now as part of that pattern?
Well, I think that in the case of the Gaza war, you're dealing with a different situation than some of the previous conflicts that you mentioned. Take the Vietnam War, for example. The Vietnam War was largely a result of America's belief in the domino theory. We believed at the time that if Vietnam became communist, other countries in Southeast Asia and eventually all over Asia and then eventually all over the globe would become communist. This was a remarkably foolish idea, but it's what motivated us. And then a lot of the wars that you described were a result of what happened after 9/11, where the United States went on a rampage and decided it was going to run around the world and promote democracy at the end of a rifle barrel. We would do social engineering at the end of a rifle barrel. The Gaza war and the Ukraine war have have different causes than Vietnam and those other conflicts. And I could go into them, but I won't do it at this point in time. But I think the point is that it all depends on the particular context of each of those wars as to why we got into them. But the general point I would make about all of them is that one thing the United States does not have is a good sense of the limits of military force. Most realists like me understand that you can't really do that much with armies, especially if you get into the business of doing social engineering around the world. It just hardly ever works because what you do inevitably is you run into nationalism. I mean, this is what happened in Vietnam. What defeated us in Vietnam was not communism, it was Vietnamese nationalism. And by the way, the reason that the Israelis are never going to succeed in beating the Palestinians into submission, the reason that the Iron Wall, to use Jabotinsky's famous phrase, is never going to work is because of nationalism, Palestinian nationalism. And the Israelis refuse to recognize that. And what I'm saying is, in a very important way, American policymakers have failed to appreciate the power of nationalism and how that gets in the way of using military force in effective ways. And as I say, I think that this is the principal problem the Israelis face in Gaza, and it's why the United States is remarkably foolish to be supporting the Israelis. Not only, of course, because it's going to fail, they're not going to defeat Hamas decisively, but also because we are complicitous in a genocide, and that is an absolutely horrible situation. It should be categorically unacceptable to every person in the administration.
Coming back for a moment to the question of the role of the Israel lobby, you used the term democracy promotion. I don't think that's your term. I don't think that's what the various administrations have called their activities, whether it's in Iraq or in Afghanistan or other countries the US has invaded. I would say that the United States has a pretty unbroken record of opposition to democracy around the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in really everywhere, and Europe as well. I mean, Europe, where they claim they share values. We know that after World War II, the United States was very closely involved in making sure that democratically elected communists couldn't come to power in countries like Italy and so on. And even as recently as the Trump administration, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, a left-wing leader, a pro-Palestinian leader, someone who has a history of opposing U.S. militarism, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, said the U.S. wouldn't allow him to come to power, basically. So it's not just so-called third world countries where the U.S. will put the boot down, it's among its so-called allies as well. So in that context, some critics of your book with Stephen Walt, The Israel Lobby, have said, as we've spoken about, that the lobby is very powerful in terms of its influence on U.S. politicians, its control of public discourse, but that U.S. policies in the region would not be that much different if the lobby didn't exist. They say, for example, that since the U.S. Has never supported an anti-colonial liberation movement outside of Palestine, just saying, in other words, U.S. opposition to democracy around the world is universal, not just when it comes to Palestinians. Therefore, there's something bigger here. Their criticism would be that, in a sense, we're scapegoating the lobby for U.S. anti-democratic imperial policies that would be the case anyway. And that, yes, maybe the lobby makes a difference in detail or degree, but not the thrust of the overall policy. The U.S. would still be anti-Palestinian absent the lobby. That's the argument.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. First of all, I want to be clear that I understand that the United States, over the course of the 20th century and into the early 21st century, has toppled many democratic regimes. I do believe that at different points along the way, especially after 9/11, we got into the business of democracy promotion. But I also believe that there are many instances of where we overthrew democracy. The United States, as I often emphasize, is a ruthless country. But just to go to your main point, look, the reason we have an Israel lobby is because if we didn't have an Israel lobby, U.S. policy towards the Middle East would be very different. The reason you have a lobby, the reason it's so powerful, and the reason the lobby works overtime is because the lobby wants to make sure that we don't treat Israel as a normal country. Now, to back that up, if you go back to Jimmy Carter, virtually every president has been interested in promoting a two-state solution, some more than others for sure. But presidents like Carter himself, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama were deeply interested in getting a two-state solution. And they could not do that. And why could they not do that? Because the lobby checked them at every turn. The reason we never even came close to getting a two-state solution, which we thought was in our interest, was because of the lobby. Furthermore, I would submit that if you look at U.S.-Iranian relations since at least the early 1990s, the Iranians have on a number of occasions showed evidence that they wanted to improve relations. And when, for example, the Clinton administration began to go down that road, the lobby quickly moved in. The lobby has had its gun sights on Iran for a long, long time, and that makes it almost impossible for us to improve our relations with Iran, which a number of presidents have wanted to do. So I would submit that if you look at American policy towards the Middle East, and you think about what it would be if there were no lobby to put pressure on American presidents vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis Iran, you'd have a different American policy.
I want to push back on that a little bit too, because I think that when we look at, for example, the way that the military-industrial complex works, when we look at the way that U.S. imperialism works around the world, when we examine how Israel was established as the early Zionists said, as a settler colonial rampart of European values in the Middle East, and how the U.S. has used Israel as a battering ram to intimidate and to destroy sovereign nations around it in the region. I think that I agree with Ali. Like, there's if the lobby didn't exist, I don't see that there would be a difference in U.S.
Well, Joe Biden said repeatedly that if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent war.
Right.
Is that in a sense the kind of the crux of it? That
I don't believe that for 1 second.
Yeah.
I don't believe that for 1 second. If you went back to 1948 and you had two alternative futures, one with a state of Israel and one without a state of Israel, the United States, from a security point of view, would be much better off without Israel.
How widespread do you think that view is in U.S. Establishment or elite circles, to the extent that you have access to their thinking?
It's impossible to say, because nobody would articulate that view publicly or even privately to most people, for the simple reason that it would get you into one hell of a lot of trouble. But you do not want to underestimate how many people inside the foreign policy establishment, including the intelligence community, or I should say especially the intelligence community, who think that Israel is a strategic liability.
I've actually seen more people expressing that over the last few months than I can remember. The sorts of people I would never have expected to hear say it will now say that openly on various YouTube channels, some of which you appear on. And of course, that's a discussion that never happens on MSNBC or CNN or in the New York Times. I mean, what do you think about the...
You can't make those arguments. You'd lose your job in a second. That's the effectiveness of the lobby. I mean, you just cannot underestimate how difficult it is to criticize Israel if you're in a mainstream position. We have this alternative media out there, which you were just referring to, of course, will talk about Israel in a frank way. They treat Israel as a normal country. They treat Israel as a normal interest group in the United States. They treat Jews as normal people. This is what happens in the alternative media. But the alternative media is fundamentally different than the mainstream media with regard to these issues.
What do you see about the trajectory here? I mean, there was a time not so long ago when this alternative, of course, there's always been alternative media, but in terms of its reach, it was much harder when you had to print newsletters and mail them around. The fact that we can have these discussions and they do reach tens or hundreds of thousands of people, and then you multiply the effect of different independent media. At a certain point, do you see the situation within the United States in particular changing? How long can elite establishment discourse and policy be completely insulated from popular opinion? I mean, I guess it always has been, except for brief moments. Do you see anything fundamental that is shifting?
Yeah, there's no question that big change is taking place. What it exactly means is very hard to say. Let me just make a number of points on this. First of all, if we went back 10 years, and you and I were talking about this, we were all talking about these issues, we would be operating in a world where hardly anybody called Israel an apartheid state. And the idea that Israel would be accused of genocide against the Palestinians was almost unthinkable, right? It just wasn't in the cards 10 years ago. We're now in a world where 50% of Joe Biden's supporters think that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Just think about that. 50% of Joe Biden's supporters in the 2020 election think that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. This is truly remarkable. And with regard to apartheid, right, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem have all written lengthy reports that lay out in detail why Israel is an apartheid state. And the point is, the situation is not going to get better. 10 years from now, the situation, I believe, in greater Israel, which includes Gaza and the West Bank, will be worse than it is today, because Israel is an apartheid state. And to run an apartheid state in this day and age, you have to dehumanize the Palestinians. This will be visible to everyone. The Palestinians will continue to resist. People will continue to say, why is this going on? Why aren't we doing certain things to stop it? And so forth and so on. Furthermore, you're going to see a continuing erosion of support for Israel among younger Jews, and certainly among younger Democrats and younger people in the United States as well. In the age of the internet, you just can't hide this stuff the way you did when I was a kid, right? When I was young, there was no internet. And my thinking about Israel was informed largely by Leon Uris's book called Exodus, which portrayed the Palestinians as the bad guys and the Israelis as the good guys. That world is so far behind us, it's hard to believe. We just live in a completely different world. So there's no question that it's going to be increasingly difficult for the lobby to keep the American body politic on board. The $64,000 question, and I was alluding to this before, is whether or not the lobby can continue to influence policymakers both on Capitol Hill and in the White House in ways that overcome that change in public opinion. That's the big question. Kind of in my heart, I say that things have to change. American policy has to change. But in my head, I tend to say that what we'll have for the foreseeable future is more of the same. Obviously, I hope my heart wins out over my head, and my crystal ball, which you were referring to, has a big crack in it on this particular issue.
Well, I agree that unless Israel is defeated and Palestine is liberated before 10 years, you're probably right that things will be worse. But I think that we live in a world where the possibility of liberation should not be discounted. But speaking of heart, I want to ask you another question, because again, you as a realist and realism as a school of thought are often accused of being heartless. You are clearly not heartless. You've written with great passion and compassion about the situation in Palestine and spoken about that today. But I want to ask you, as a realist, what role do morality and law play in international relations? What role do they play, and what role should they play?
Well, we all have both a moral compass and let's call it a strategic compass. In my case, it's a realist compass. When I look out at the world, I think of it in realist terms. And I obviously, as I hope is clear from our discussion today, have a moral compass, and I think about the world in moral terms as well as realist terms. Now, the question is, what's the relationship between moral considerations and realist considerations in my mind? I think that there are a good number of instances where moral logic and strategic logic or realist logic line up, and you can pursue a realist policy that is backed by by moral logic. I often make the argument when the United States fought against Adolf Hitler in World War II, that this was a case where strategic logic and moral logic lined up. It was a good war, the war against Adolf Hitler. I also think there are a lot of cases where there's no strategic logic at play. And I think the best case here is Rwanda. I was fully in favor of intervening in Rwanda in the early 1990s because there was just simply no strategic logic at play. It didn't matter for the balance of power. And from a moral point of view, my moral compass said go in there and do everything you can to shut that genocide down as quickly as possible. So you have those two sets of cases. But the really tricky cases are ones where the strategic logic points in one direction, and the moral logic or the moral compass points in the other direction. And my argument is that in international anarchy, in the world that we live in, when the moral compass and the realist compass are at odds, you will act according to the dictates of realist logic, because underpinning realist logic is the motive of survival. And states want to survive, just like individuals want to survive, and they'll do whatever necessary to survive. And if international law says to do something, or moral logic or just war theory says to do something that is at odds with realist logic, the leader will, I believe, every time go with realist logic, again, because of the survival imperative. Am I happy about this? No. It's kind of depressing. It's why I titled my well-known book on realism, as you know, Tragedy of Great Power Politics. There's a real tragic element to all of this, but it is the way the world works. And as you said when you introduced me, it is important to realize that this logic is at play, that there is this tragic element to international politics, and to think about how to smartly navigate it.
Professor Mearsheimer, we just have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to just get your take on U.S. empire and the reaches of U.S. empire and the destructiveness and the immorality of it. Do you think that the U.S. empire is coming to an end, especially when we look at how it is co-authoring this genocide in Gaza?
We saved the easy questions.
Yeah, sorry. 1 minute or less, no.
Well, the truth is, Nora, I don't think of the United States in terms of an empire. When I use the word empire, I think of the British Empire, the French Empire. I think of the United States as a great power that has tremendous reach and interferes in the politics of every country on the planet. And Ollie was getting at this before. I have no doubt that the United States does not respect the sovereignty of almost every country on the planet. We're constantly meddling in everybody else's politics. But what matters most for me in terms of thinking about the world is the constellation of great powers. And I think that when I was young and grew up during the Cold War, we lived in a bipolar world, and there were two countries that really mattered for shaping international politics. This is not to say other countries didn't matter, but the two countries that mattered most were the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and of course the Cold War ended, we moved into the unipolar moment. And the United States was the only great power. It was the only superpower on the planet. And this is when it became fashionable to talk about the United States as an empire, because we were so powerful and we were doing so much meddling that it made sense to a lot of people to think about the United States as an empire. Whether you agree with that characterization of the United States as an empire or not during the unipolar moment, the key point I think that you want to keep in mind is that unipolarity came to an end in about 2017. It's just very important to understand that the world that we live in today is a multipolar world. We have three great powers: China, Russia, and the United States. So the United States, although it may be the most powerful state on the planet, has two rival great powers out there that cause the United States a lot of trouble and limit what the United States can do. China, indeed, is a peer competitor. It's not as powerful as the United States, but it's not that far away, and it's growing both economically and militarily. And with regard to Russia, what happened when Putin came to power in 2000 is that over the course of the next roughly 24 years, what he did was he brought the Russians back from the dead. Russia is once again a great power. And as it's demonstrating in Ukraine, it is in a position where it can thwart the West, which is another way of saying it can thwart the United States and cause us all sorts of problems. And of course, the Chinese can cause us all sorts of problems. So our power is much more limited today than it was during the unipolar moment. And it's not the end of empire, right? The United States, in my opinion, was never really an empire, but one could argue that that's a definitional issue. But it is certainly a world in which the United States' maneuver room is much less. And we have to be much more careful maneuvering through these troubled waters.
All right.